Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting to you live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of Rabbi Michael SKOBAC Cross-Examines the New Testament. Tonight we are on episode number 31, Matthew 27, Part A. So coming to you from our northern, colder climate, Canada, with the happy Rabbi. Rabbi, how are you, sir?
Baruch Hashem, thank God. We're going through a heat wave here, so I'm really happy.
That's funny. You remind me of how they say the news and weather here in Texas. During the summertime, it's like 112 degrees, and they say, we got a cool front coming in. It dropped down to 109. So that, yeah. Oh, boy. Go figure. It is what it is, right? So, awesome. Well,
for us, double digits is when we break 9.
Oh.
9 centigrade.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah. So we've had record high temperatures here, and snow is nowhere in sight. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we're happy campers here.
You know, it has been record highs here as well. We've been like, I think today we was up at 68. It felt like it was almost 70. I could be off on that, but it certainly felt every bit of that. And I'm just really wondering where the winter went to. I should probably appreciate it while it's away, because when it comes, I'll certainly be complaining. You can count on that, unfortunately. So very good. Well, Rabbi, you're saying that this week is going to be a really expressly compact and highly concentrated. So we divided it into 2 weeks. Of course, we'll keep the numbers flowing, but the part. So this week we'll do the first part of chapter 27, part A, and then next week we'll do part B. And then we'll see.
We could have theoretically finished it in one night, but I would have to speak like a New Yorker at 400 miles an hour. And so this is more relaxed, and we'll do it in a more relaxed clip. We'll go about halfway through tonight. Good. And we'll just finish up next week, and that should be fine.
That sounds great. Okay, well, I'm ready when you are, sir. First of all, real quickly, how was your Hanukkah? This is your closure.
Hanukkah is awesome. I just came from an amazing at one of the big synagogues here in Toronto. I was invited to be the guest speaker, and they had celebrating completion of a tractate of the Talmud, and they tied it into Hanukkah. Tonight's the last night of Hanukkah, and just the spirit and wonderful dancing, and it was great, really great. And so Hanukkah, I can't get enough of Hanukkah.
That's really cool.
Me and Adam Sandler.
You'll have to tell me a little bit about that one. I know Adam Sandler. I haven't seen his. I've seen a lot of his movies back in the day, and I haven't seen anything lately. But I know he's a Jewish guy, and there's a lot of popular Jewish people. In fact, you're going to see me start dressing like one soon. I think what's the guy's name? The dude with the really curly hair, long curly hair. He's wearing pop bottle black sunglasses all the time. Howard Stern. And it's the lighting. I know it is. I put a Facebook message up earlier that the lights are just like really baking my eyes. And I said, what do we do? A lot of people recommended LED, switched from fluorescent to LED. And some said, just put on some sunglasses. It'll be cheaper. I said, okay. I like that idea. We might have to try that. So if y'all see me wearing
shades.
Yes, exactly. So if you see me wearing shades, I'm not trying to be cool, although maybe it will help me go that route too. All right, dear Rabbi, why don't you take us away, and I'll try to follow you along the best I can with the Bible software, and we'll see what we can make of it, okay? All right, well, we're gonna switch over. It looks like I lost him there for a second. Yep, it's trying to call him back. Had a little bit of a, are we there? Can you hear me? So basically, let me pull up Matthew while we're trying to reconnect there. We're going to pull up Matthew chapter 27 right now, hopefully for all of you who are tuning in. Every once in a while, we do get some internet issues on the outside coming in, so we'll just have to play it out and see what happens here. Call, Skype, there we go. Let's see what happens here. All right. Wow. Well, it's been a great week for us for Hanukkah, I'll tell you what, because the kids have just been, they got a lot of interesting things they were completely unexpected. And myself as well. My wife was so sweet. She bought me these cute little round. I call them a cow brush, but it's like a little round brush that's got a little bird-looking shaped handle where you stick 2 fingers in. And I actually had one of those years ago, and the finger points broke off of it, and then I lost the brush, but then I found it, so I kept it. And now I've only got one when I had three. So little did I know she had bought me a 3-pack of them. I don't even know how she found them, but she sure did. And that was just like the coolest Hanukkah present I think I've had in a long time. I got one cow brush for my head, one cow brush for my beard. Anyway, we won't go. Rabbi, you missed out on all the fun stuff. So I don't own a cow, just in case you were wondering. So.
Okay, that's good to hear. So I don't have to. I think we're just disconnected.
Yeah, there's what I'm picking up on my end is I'm seeing there's an internet flow signal somewhere in the lines, and so if it happens again, don't worry, we'll just reconnect and we'll just keep on going like it never happened. So
okay, we'll be tough tonight.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. All right, very good. Well, like I said, I'll follow you with the Bible. I've got the Hebrew and the English, so whatever you choose to reflect back on, and I'll have that up as you're reading it along. And I'll try to be quiet, but much as I can, so you can do what you've got to do.
That's what John Wayne said. A man's got to do what a man's got to do.
All right, Rabbi, it's all yours.
So just to put us, we've been out of touch for a while. We've had our sound issues, but thank God we were resurrected today.
Yes, thank you, Justin. You're the man.
Justin was the man with the plan.
Man with the plan.
And so last time we met, we covered Matthew 26, and there you had, the story of the Last Supper, the last meal that Jesus has with his disciples, and he's shortly afterward. He's betrayed. His erstwhile disciple Judas Iscariot basically betrays him. He blows the cover of Jesus and points the high priest has sent a contingent of soldiers to come and arrest Jesus, and so Jesus is arrested and he's put on trial. This is taking place at night, and we analyzed with a little bit of detail all the problems or some of the problems with this trial, and how difficult it is to square the account of this trial, with the gospel account. It's very difficult to accept at face value. But in any event, he has this trumped up trial on trumped up charges, not in front of the Roman court at this point. This is the evening of the Last Supper, and then chapter 27 begins now with the morning of the next day. So according to most accounts, this would be Friday morning. And so when morning came, let's assume this is first thing in the morning, because these guys, God forbid, don't like to sleep late, although we know most of the Romans didn't get up at the crack of dawn to do their legal responsibilities. But we're told that in the morning, and we'll see in a few minutes the timing problem here. So in the morning, when the morning came, all the chief priests and elders of the people plotted against Jesus to put him to death. Now, we've had this hyperbole before, where the gospel writers speak about all the Pharisees coming. Every single one of them shows up. It's obviously an exaggeration here to speak about all the chief priests and all the elders. We know that Matthew himself later tells us that Joseph of Arimathea, who was one of the elders, wasn't in on this plot. So aside from the fact that we're told specifically there were people in leadership who were not in on the plot to destroy Jesus, just saying that they all came together is pretty absurd. In any event, what's interesting is that we get this statement coming out of the blue here, supposedly that they all now get together to plot against Jesus to put him to death. But we already heard this exact same refrain in the previous chapter, in chapter 26, verse 59. It already says they plotted against Jesus to put him to death. So I don't know what kind of a new plot this is. Why does this come up again when we've already been told this in the previous chapter? In the previous chapter, we're told that in the plotting, they tried to find false witnesses to testify against Jesus. But again, here in the morning, they seem to get together again and come up with new plots to kill Jesus. And it says in verse 2, when they bound him, They led him away to be delivered to Pontius Pilate, who was the governor. Now, it seems, according to both Jewish sources and even hints at this in the Gospels themselves, that the Jewish courts did not really have the jurisdiction at that time to put people to death. They weren't really hearing anymore at this time capital cases. And so if they were really not going to put Jesus to death after their monkey trial, and we saw their monkey trial in the previous chapter, and they were only going to turn Jesus over to the Romans anyway for him to be tried by the Romans. So what was the whole point of having a trial in chapter 26? What was the purpose of that trial if that trial couldn't lead to a death sentence anyway, and that they would be able to carry out? And so what is the point of having it if they're going to have to turn him over to the Romans for the Romans trial here in chapter 27? Obviously, the Romans would have been totally unconcerned about the issues that were raised at the Jewish trial. So if Jesus was being charged with blasphemy by the chief priests, what do the Romans care about that? The Romans are not going to get bent out of shape because Jesus violated the Jewish law about blaspheming God. The Romans are not going to get upset if they heard that Jesus was accused of threatening to destroy the temple and then to rebuild it by himself. I mean, they would just laugh at situations like this. The only thing that would have gotten the attention of the Romans would have been for the Jewish authorities to let Pilate know that Jesus was claiming to be the king of the Jews, and that Jesus himself received a royal reception all the way back in Matthew chapter 21, where he comes into Jerusalem and all the huge crowds greet him, Hosanna, the son of David. Now, as we discussed in the past, it's very unlikely the Romans wouldn't have known about that already. The Romans were very, very security conscious, especially at the times of the holidays, especially at Passover time. They had huge numbers of guards and security people around. And so, the fact that you had someone marching into Jerusalem with a group of followers who were armed with swords being accepted by the crowds as the king of the Jews, the Romans would have been all over that. And as we said in the past classes here, there would have been no need to have a Jewish follower of Jesus betray him to the Romans or betray him to anyone. And he was a public figure. He came into the temple already. He caused a ruckus there. So this is all very difficult to accept at face value as a historical account. It's very clear that the Romans probably knew exactly what was going on. And we already know, as we'll see, why Jesus really was executed. The Romans didn't care if he broke any Jewish laws whatsoever. So starting with verse 3, we have a little bit of a detour. We're told here the story of what Judas Iscariot does, because it says that the betrayer of Jesus, Judas Iscariot, saw that Jesus had been condemned, and so he was very remorseful, we're told here in Matthew, and he took back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, "I've sinned by betraying innocent blood." And they said, "What is that to us? What do we care? You see to it. I mean, you feel guilty, you deal with it." And then it says in verse 5 that he threw down the pieces of silver in the temple and departed and went and hanged himself. But in verse 6, we're told the chief priests took the silver pieces and they said, "It's not lawful, it's not proper to put them into the sanctuary, into the treasury, because they are the price of blood. This is blood money." So they consulted together and they bought with these coins a potter's field to bury strangers in it. Therefore, that field has been called the field of blood to this day. And then was fulfilled that which was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, "And they took the 30 pieces of silver and the value of him who was priced, whom they of the children of Israel priced, and they gave them for the potter's field as the Lord directed me." So let's discuss, if we could, this unusual passage about Judas Iscariot. First of all, if we compare this narrative to the book of Acts, which according to most people was written by Luke. So the first chapter in the book of Acts doesn't have Judas hanging himself. He meets another fate. We're told in the first chapter of Acts that with the reward he got, this is in verse 18, so with the reward that he, Judas Iscariot, got for his wickedness, Judas bought a field. He purchased the field. And there he fell headlong. He fell in this field, and his body burst open, and all his intestines spilled out. It's pretty gruesome, but it doesn't describe a hanging. And also, it's interesting that in Acts, he doesn't seem to express any remorse. There's no remorse that he expresses in the book of Acts, whereas in Matthew, he feels very guilty and he returns the money. Now, it's interesting that in Acts, there's a different reason given for the name of the field. In Matthew, the field is called the field of blood because it was purchased with this blood money. But in the book of Acts, it's called the field of blood because that's where his guts were spilled out. So different reasons given for the name of the field. It's interesting, by the way, this is just an aside, that the concern here is that the money that he's returning is what they call blood money. And in Hebrew, it's very interesting that the very same word is used in Hebrew for both blood and money. So in Hebrew, dam is blood. In plural, you would say damim. And yet the word damim is also the word in Hebrew for money. So it's interesting that blood money, uses the same word that has two different meanings.
Interesting.
Now, what's famous about this passage in Matthew is that the gospel writer here appeals to a verse in the book of Jeremiah and claims that this entire incident of Jeremiah throwing the 30 pieces of silver back into the temple, feeling guilty about having betrayed Jesus for this amount of money, this was all prophesied according to the gospel writer Matthew. And he claims that the fact that he throws the money back and that the money is then taken and is used to purchase a field, a potter's field. Again, Matthew tells us this is not just something that just happened to take place, but Matthew said this was all foretold. This is all prophesied. And he says it's a prophecy from the book of Jeremiah. And the problem is, the people who've studied this, that there is no such verse at all in the prophet Jeremiah. You have basically here 3 different passages that Matthew seems to be conflating. 2 of them are from Jeremiah, and 1 is from the prophet Zechariah, and that seems to be really the one that Matthew means. But in Jeremiah chapter 32, verses 8 to 9, there the prophet himself purchases a field for 17 silver shekels. So you have the purchase of a field in Jeremiah 32.
What verse did you say that was? Oh, right here.
So
in
that was
32:8.
verses 8 to 9 in chapter 32 of Jeremiah. Now in chapter 18 of Jeremiah, verses 2 to 3, there the prophet visits a potter's house, the house of a potter. So here you have in Jeremiah, the purchase of a field, and you have the potter. There were just 2 different chapters, not having to do anything with each other. But of course, Matthew is not quoting from Jeremiah. He's quoting really from Zechariah, even though he calls it Jeremiah. And the passage that he's referring to in Zechariah is chapter 11, verses 12 to 13. Now there's a reference to 30 pieces of silver. Let me just read that passage.
That was chapter 11, verse 12. Yep. Got
Yeah.
it right there. Okay.
Oh, you have it there?
I do. Yeah. It says, and
Okay.
Okay, this is the King James.
So I said to the people, I'm reading from a Jewish translation here, the Art
Okay.
Scroll. I said to the people, if it's proper in your eyes, give me my fee, and if not, refrain. So they weighed out my fee, 30 silver coins. And then Hashem said to me, throw it to the treasurer of the precious stronghold, which I have divested from them. So I took the 30 silver coins and I threw it into the temple of Hashem to the treasurer. Now, what you have basically is Matthew appealing to a verse in Jeremiah, but it really is a cut and paste operation that really only works when you combine these three verses, one from Jeremiah 32, one from Jeremiah 18, and this last one from Zechariah chapter 11. The real problem, here is that the context of Zechariah it's not messianic. It's not speaking about something that's going to happen in the times of the Messiah. It's not a messianic prophecy, and it's clearly not about Jesus or anything taking place during the time of Jesus. It's clear that in the prophet Zechariah, he is the one. Zechariah himself, the prophet, is the one that's told to take 30 pieces of silver, and it's not a prophecy about a wicked person who throws them back into the temple treasury. So really what's going on here is a disaster. It's a mess where Matthew is only able to create this illusion of the fulfillment of prophecy from the Hebrew scriptures by combining three different verses, taking them all out of context, mixing them up, and then somehow appealing to them. It's just a disaster. And it's not the worst disaster we're going to see in chapter 27 here. So moving on to verse 11, now you finally have the trial of Jesus before Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate is the governor. He's actually called the procurator of Judea. He's in charge of everything taking place in Jerusalem. And the Romans had a number of people that were in this position. It wasn't an easy job to have. And so in verse 11, Jesus stands before the governor, and the governor asks him, saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Now, this is really the only question that would be of interest to Pontius Pilate. Again, he's not going to ask Jesus, did you eat pastrami with milkshake? Did you eat milk and milk? He doesn't care if Jesus is observing the Torah. He doesn't care if Jesus was guilty of blaspheming God or violating the laws of the Sabbath. He's not interested in that. If it doesn't affect him, he doesn't care about it, and he's going to say, this is really none of my concern. But what would be of concern to Pontius Pilate is Jesus a threat to the Roman authority? Is he challenging the Roman authority? Is he trying to basically lead a rebellion of the people against Roman rule? And someone who's claiming to be the Messiah, someone who's claiming to be the king of the Jews, with all that implies, that would be of concern to the Romans. And so Pontius Pilate asks him right away, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And we've seen in the past that Jesus has a style of never really answering questions like this directly. He usually is cute in his answers, or he answers indirectly. So here he says in Matthew, "It is as you say." Basically, Pontius Pilate says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus says, "Well, you said it." In Mark chapter 14, verse 62, Jesus is a bit more direct and says simply, "I am. I am." So he's asked the question, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answers fairly directly, "I am." And then in verse 12, while he was being accused by the chief of priests and elders, he answered nothing. Now, it doesn't explain here what the chief priests and the elders were accusing him of. Again, it doesn't sound like they would be accusing him of claiming to be the Messiah, because that's already been discussed. And if they're going to be asking him about, did you actually say you're going to destroy the temple and rebuild it? Did you actually call yourself the Son of God and claiming to be God? These are all questions that simply would not concern Pontius Pilate. And so he doesn't answer them. And in verse 14, we're told that he didn't answer one word to any of these accusations, and the governor marveled greatly. Now, it's not clear exactly what that means, that Pontius Pilate marveled greatly. It could mean that he was extremely impressed with Jesus. He was very impressed that here is someone that is not even answering, defending himself against his accusers. He might have been impressed by that, or he might have been just puzzled by it. How could someone stand here and not defend himself? So it's not really clear if this is a positive view that Pontius Pilate now has of Jesus, or if it's sort of questioning or puzzlement because it seems like such strange behavior. But what's interesting to remember is that Pilate's reaction to Jesus is strange, because when he asks Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" and Jesus basically says, "I am," again in Mark directly and here less directly, that's something that should have really bothered Pontius Pilate. It should have gotten his ears perked up, and it should have gotten him concerned, very concerned, that here's someone coming to Jerusalem at Passover time, claiming to be the king of the Jews and having a bit of a following, and yet Pontius Pilate doesn't blink.
Mm-hmm.
He simply doesn't blink. And that's peculiar. That's very, very strange. It doesn't make any sense, really, because, again, we went back to Matthew chapter 2, and we saw the reaction that Herod had to not a 30-year-old Jesus with followers with swords. We saw the reaction that Herod had to the infant Jesus, who was still crawling around on all fours. And he is so concerned about this potential Messiah that he tries to kill all the Jewish babies under the age of 2 in Bethlehem and all the surrounding cities. And so it's impossible, really, to understand why Pontius Pilate doesn't really even blink here. He doesn't seem to be concerned at all. Now, we know exactly why Jesus was executed. And that's why, again, it's hard to accept this narrative at face value. Are we really supposed to believe that Pontius Pilate doesn't say a word, is not concerned at all about Jesus claiming to be the king of the Jews, when that was the very question that concerned Pontius Pilate, right? Are you the king of the Jews? Basically, yes, I am. And then no reaction. And yet we know that Jesus is killed for sedition. That's exactly why the Romans have him crucified. First of all, we see that Jesus is crucified between 2 other revolutionaries. Now, often people think that these 2 other people crucified with Jesus were just thieves or robbers. But the truth is that the Romans didn't normally crucify people for pickpocketing or, stealing something from someone's house or from robbing people. They generally only executed people by crucifixion for political crimes that were seen as potential threats to the establishment, to the peace of the kingdom. And so it's interesting that Matthew calls these 2 people that are crucified with Jesus, he refers to them as really robbers, people
thieves,
who were
right.
thieves. And yet we know later on that they're not referred to, at least in the Gospel of Luke, as just robbers, but they're referred to as people who were revolutionaries, people who were there not just for robbing, but really for more serious crimes. And what's interesting is that the charge that Jesus is charged with is placed right over his head on the titulus of the crucifix, of the crucifixion stake it's written above his head, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. That's the Romans would charge people with the crime, and the crime would be spelled out right on the cross itself. They would write what the people were charged with. And so what you see here is that Jesus is not accused of blaspheming or breaking any rules of the Torah. He's accused of a crime that the Romans took very, very seriously. So on the one hand, you have Jesus being executed for claiming to be the king of the Jews by the Romans, and yet during the trial, Pontius Pilate's behavior is very, very strange. He seems to be thoroughly, just not registering or not bothered at all by Jesus at all. Now, what's really strange is that in the narrative of the final days of Jesus, this final day, the Gospel of Luke shares a story that is not found in any other gospel, because you find in Luke chapter 23, verses 6 to 16, a sort of a side story that takes place right after this trial with Pontius Pilate. And Luke basically says that at this point, Jesus is taken from the meeting with Pontius Pilate to a separate trial with Herod. This obviously is not Herod, but the descendant of Herod, who was the ruler of the Galilee. So you had Pontius Pilate, whose jurisdiction is Judea, and Herod at that time, who was ruling in the Galilee, who just happened to be in Jerusalem for the Passover holiday. And so Pontius Pilate sends Jesus to Herod for a separate trial. And at that trial in Luke chapter 23, Herod as well doesn't find Jesus guilty of anything. Herod seems to be totally nonplussed by Jesus, doesn't see any problems with Jesus, basically says, get lost, there's nothing wrong here. Now, what's hard to believe is the following in terms of timeline. If you follow Mark's gospel, Mark basically says that Jesus is crucified at about 9 o'clock in the morning. This is in Mark chapter 15, verse 25. So what we're led to believe now is that on Friday morning, Jesus happens to be in the custody of the elders and the chief priests. They take him at that point, at the morning breaking, they take him to a trial in front of Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate has his discussions with Jesus, and then he goes from there, wherever he is with Pontius Pilate, he goes from there and is taken to a separate meeting somewhere else with Herod. He has his trial in front of Herod, and then he's returned back to Pontius Pilate, where Pontius Pilate pronounces judgment upon him. He has Jesus scourged and whipped and beaten, and then he is taken to be crucified all before 9 o'clock in the morning. Now, that's assuming that the Romans got up at the crack of dawn, let's say at 6 o'clock in the morning, that he had all those trials in different places back and forth with all the traveling. All that takes less than 3 hours. So it's a little bit hard to imagine how that worked out in reality. Now, you have here the next piece, which is in chapter 27, verses 15 to 26. What I would say is probably one of the least historical passages in the entire New Testament. When you read this next passage, you have to really just scratch your head and wonder if any of it is true. So let's first read it and then analyze it. So in verse 15, now at the feast, the governor was accustomed, he's saying basically, this is a sort of an editorial comment Matthew puts in, that at the feast, meaning at the festival, at the Jewish festival, the governor was accustomed to releasing to the multitude one prisoner whom they wished. And at that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. Therefore, when they had gathered together, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release to you?" He's asking the Jewish crowd at this point. "Barabbas or Jesus, who happens to be called the Christ, the Messiah?" And it says in verse 18, for Pilate knew that they had handed him over because of envy. Now, it's not clear exactly what that means. First of all, how did Pilate know this? And what exactly are these people who handed Jesus over envious of? So it's not really clear what this means. So in verse 19, while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent to him, saying, "Have nothing to do with this just man, for I have suffered many things today in a dream because of him." Also a strange little detail in the story. And again, it was interesting, we'll see, is that we're going to have Pontius Pilate basically saying straight out he sees no guilt in Jesus. And here his wife is testifying that he's a just man. So she warns Pontius Pilate, she warns her husband, be careful with this Jesus. But in verse 20, the chief priests and the elders persuaded the multitudes that they should ask for Barabbas and not Jesus, and that they should destroy Jesus. So the governor answered and said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" And they say, "Barabbas. We want Barabbas." And Pilate said to them, "What then shall I do with Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" And they all said to him, "Let him be crucified." Then the governor said, "Why? Why crucify him? What evil has he done?" So it seems Pilate himself sees no problem with Jesus, and he can't understand why anyone else has a problem with Jesus, even though allegedly Pilate sat there through all the accusations that the chief priests and the elders were leveling against Jesus. He says here, for some reason, what's the problem? Now, I would imagine that whatever they were accusing Jesus of, Pontius Pilate really saw no problem with this, because these were probably accusations that would not have concerned him in the least. So he's mystified here. He doesn't understand why should they want Jesus crucified? What evil has he done? But they cried out all the more, saying, "Let him be crucified." So in verse 24, when Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, meaning that he seemed to be arguing with this crowd, saying, "Look, leave the guy alone. What do you want from him?" But they seemed to overpower Pontius Pilate. But rather that a tumult was rising, there was a lot of tumult in the crowd, Pilate takes water and washes his hands before the multitude, saying, "I am innocent of the blood of this just person." He himself now refers to Jesus as a just or righteous person. "You see to it," meaning you want him killed, you do it. And all the people answered and said, "His blood be on us and our children." So then he releases Barabbas to them. Barabbas gets out of jail. He's set free. And then Pilate scourges Jesus and delivered him to be crucified. So again, I would say this is probably one of the least historical passages in the entire New Testament. First of all, it's very unlikely there was such a Roman custom to have the Jewish community get a get-out-of-jail-free card for one prisoner each Jewish holiday. He's saying this was taking place during the festivals. There were 3 Jewish festivals during the year. It's hard to imagine that the Romans, the sweet people that they were, would say to the Jewish people, because, we cherish you as our citizens so much, we want you to feel good, so you're going to get to take any prisoner you want out of prison for each of the Jewish holidays. They could choose someone who could be a dangerous threat to the Roman authority. You could have had in jail a very dangerous insurrectionist, a dangerous counter-revolutionary, someone who was leading an active and violent rebellion against the Romans. And if the Jews said, "We want him," then they would say, "Fine." It's almost impossible to imagine the Romans had such a custom, and there's no historical verification. There's no historical sources showing us that the Romans actually had such a custom.
I think what was connected for the Christian side of things was, although incorrectly, was the whole idea of Yom Kippur and the scapegoat, where they had two goats and one was set free. And I think that they really had blended those two stories because they're all in the same chapter, of course, in the Torah. They got them confused, and I really, because there's so many similarities in this particular story with the whole idea of Pesach, which is really, really, I mean, with Yom Kippur, I'm sorry. And so that's kind of how it was explained away. And using that logic, I guess, if you had these authors of the New Testament that may not have been very educated with the laws of Torah, maybe they had it confused too, and this is how they made it work.
It's an interesting speculation. I'm not sure that really is what was going on, at least in the Romans' mind. Right. That they would offer that one would get out of jail for free. Because again, at least in the Roman account here, it's not just a Passover custom. It would be a holiday custom, which would be for Sukkot and Shavuot as well. Now, it's interesting that also it's strange, by the way, that they only had two people in jail. The Romans were probably arresting many Jews. And so it is strange that there are only two guys in jail. But the other one is named Barabbas. Now, most Christians or most readers pronounce his name Barabbas, but really the correct pronunciation would be Barabbas, which translated means the son of the Father, which is a very interesting name because, people always associate, Jesus as being the son of the Father. So here you have two people in jail. You have Jesus of Nazareth, and then you have this person named Barabbas, the son of the Father. And actually, in some New Testament manuscripts, he's actually referred to as Jesus Barabbas. Jesus, the son of the Father. Now, Chaim Maccobi speculates that it's really the same person, that Jesus of Nazareth is Jesus Barabbas. I'm not going to recap his theories. I'm willing to just, for the sake of reading the chapter, assume there are two people in prison here. But what's interesting is that in Luke chapter 23, verse 25, Barabbas is referred to as a murderer and an insurrectionist. So who do you have in prison here? You have someone who's a murderer and an insurrectionist. And you have Jesus, who was, according to many people in Jerusalem, the Messiah. We know that there were huge crowds that had greeted Jesus as the Messiah, the son of David. So what's very difficult to understand is that if this option was given to the Jewish people, an option to get one of their prisoners out of jail for free, and they were offered two people, one who's a murderer and one who is someone that is not just claiming to be the Messiah, but many people believe that he was the Messiah and welcomed him as the Messiah, why all of a sudden would this crowd ask for a Barabbas to be released from prison? Mm-hmm. It sounds like a very, very strange choice. I really would recommend very highly for people who want to study this further a book by Chaim Maccobi called The Revolution in Judea, which is an amazing study of the Gospels and a very, I think, important coverage of these chapters of the trial and death of Jesus. So I just want to recap here because the scene is very strange. Here you have allegedly, Pontius Pilate is constantly repeating how he sees nothing wrong with Jesus. He can't understand why Jesus should be executed. And yet we know very well that Pontius Pilate, as a brutal Roman procurator, would see very quickly why Jesus should be executed. And we know that he did execute him for the crime of calling himself, referring to himself as the King of the Jews. So there's this huge problem in the gospel account itself, where on the one hand, Pilate executes Jesus for the crime of sedition, of claiming to be the king of the Jews. And yet, through the trial and the entire account, he seems to ignore it. He doesn't seem to accept that Jesus is guilty of anything. So the entire behavior of Pontius Pilate is almost impossible to understand. His washing of his hands, his proclaiming that he doesn't see any guilt in this man, and yet we know there were huge, huge reasons why he should see him as guilty, and we know ultimately he executed him exactly for these crimes. But then you have the Gospels saying that even though Pontius Pilate didn't want to touch a hair on Jesus' head, it were the Jewish leaders, the priests and the elders, who persuaded not just Pontius Pilate, but who persuaded the multitudes to really turn Jesus in. Meaning that we saw previously the multitudes welcome Jesus as the Son of David, as the Messiah, and somehow it's these chief priests and elders who get the crowds themselves to just after a few days say about this person they had welcomed as the Messiah, no, we don't want him out of jail. And what do we want to happen to him? He should be crucified. Now, it's really almost impossible to understand why these people would choose Barabbas and why they would want Jesus to be killed. They should have just said, even if they wanted Barabbas, they should have said, just leave Jesus in jail. What is their sort of murderous and vicious? And if you go back to the Mel Gibson movie, you know, you have little devils coming out of their faces when they're saying this now. It's really an incredible scene, to the point where, you know, they end up saying something that's totally non-believable in terms of what we know about Jewish people, that they basically call upon them, their children, to be cursed. They say, may his blood be upon us and our children. Now, it's impossible to imagine Jewish parents, you know, saying that their little children, both little infants now and unborn children, should be held responsible for the blood of this person that's going to be killed. Almost impossible to imagine. But it's hard to understand how the leaders here could get the people to totally change their mind about Jesus. Now, some Christian commentaries propose that there were different crowds, and that maybe that's why they weren't changing anyone's mind. But even if it was a different crowd, why would a different crowd prefer, you know, even if they hadn't proclaimed Jesus as the Messiah, but even a neutral crowd, why would they choose to have a robber and a murderer taken out of jail than someone who was at least claiming to be the king of the Jews and the Messiah? Why choose the murderer over the one claiming to be the Messiah? And why, again, insist that Jesus be crucified? It's just almost impossible to imagine, especially, don't forget, back in Matthew 21, verse 11, we're told that it was almost impossible for them to even arrest Jesus because the masses of people thought of him as at least a prophet. So you have all of these buildups about the credibility of Jesus, and we saw previously in the Gospels about how they're constantly painting Jesus as being incredibly popular. He's healing people, and people are following him, and crowds and huge masses of people. And so on the one hand, the Gospels build him up as incredibly popular. He's got huge following all over the place. People thinking of him as a prophet, people accepting him as the Messiah. And now all of a sudden they're turning on him, and no real credible reason can be given. Again, one of the huge problems here is that Pilate is portrayed as a pretty easygoing guy, doesn't really see any problems with Jesus, is bewildered by the Jewish leaders who are pressing for Jesus to be killed, and he doesn't understand it, and he's puzzled by it. He wants to wash his hands. He wants to proclaim Jesus innocent, and it almost portrays Pilate as being bullied and pressured by the Jewish crowds to go along with their desire to crucify Jesus. Now, the problem we know is that in all of the contemporary records of who this Pontius Pilate is, he wasn't a sweet guy who was hard to move with his passion against the Jews. He was brutal in his treatment of the Jewish people. The Gospels themselves say that he butchered many, many Jewish people, and the Roman records tell us that the Romans themselves had to relieve him of his responsibilities in Jerusalem because of all of the atrocities he committed against the Jews. Philo of Judea, who was in Alexandria at the very same time of Jesus, a contemporary. So Philo writes about Pontius Pilate as being the most brutal, vicious procurator that ever was in Judea. And as well, Josephus writes about him as being a very violent, vicious person. He's not the sort of easygoing softy that the gospel here portrays him as. Let's move on, because we're running sort of time, to verse 27. And here, after Jesus has been scourged, by the way, another problem with that is, if Pilate sees no problem with Jesus, why does he order him to be scourged? He just could have had him taken out to be crucified, but he's additionally adding on more torture to Jesus by this brutal beating that he receives. We know that the Roman scourging was very, very brutal and painful. So why does Pilate do that to Jesus if he sees no problem with Jesus, if he sees him as totally innocent? But then after that, he's taken, and the soldiers of the governor take Jesus into the praetorium and gather the whole garrison around him. So again, this is not a Jewish crowd that's doing this. These are the Roman soldiers. And they stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. And when they had twisted a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and a reed in his right hand. And they bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, the King of the Jews." And then they spat on him and took the reed and struck him on the head. And when they had mocked him, they took the robe off of him, put his own clothing back on, and led him away to be crucified. So again, this is hard to square with the gospel writer's insistence that the Romans didn't really find any guilt in Jesus. They really saw him as totally innocent. Here, it seems that Pontius Pilate has already ordered Jesus to be tortured, to be scourged. Pontius Pilate is the one that sends him to be crucified for the crime of being king of the Jews, even though they mock him, because it's sort of, to them, ridiculous that someone who is claiming to be the king of the Jews is now being led to his crucifixion. Now, just a few details here, that Matthew claims that they put a scarlet robe on Jesus, but in John chapter 19, verse 2, and Mark chapter 15, verse 17, we're told that it was a purple robe, not a scarlet robe. Now, some Christian commentaries insist that these are two colors. They're really the same color, that they're claiming that these two words in Greek really are speaking about the same color. The problem is that in Greek, these are two different words, and in Revelation chapter 17, verse 4, they are spoken of as two different colors. So it's a minor problem, but again, it's a little bit of a discrepancy between the stories. And again, what you see is that the Romans here both take his claim to being king of the Jews seriously enough to execute him, but they don't take it that seriously because they seem to mock him and make fun of him. So it's hard. Is it A or B? Do they not take the claim seriously, or do they take it seriously? And I would say that the Romans took this claim very seriously. And the problem is that the gospel writers very clearly are trying to deflect the guilt of the crucifixion away from the Romans and the responsibility onto the Jews. That's why I would imagine that Luke added that second trial in front of Herod. That he shows, according to Luke, he shows that both Herod and Pontius Pilate both try Jesus, but neither of them find him guilty. And therefore, it sort of highlights that it must have been the Jews who were responsible for his death. But it seems very clear that the Romans took Jesus and those who saw him as the king of the Jews as a serious threat, serious enough to have him executed for that crime. And what happens in the Gospels is this ongoing attempt to sort of whitewash the story in a way where the Romans seem less and less involved with the story, and the Jews seem to be this villainous, evil, vicious crowd who were just foaming at the mouth and screaming for his crucifixion and execution, and even that their children should be held responsible for it. So it's a very, very difficult story to read and to just simply accept at face value. Next week, God willing, we'll continue and then complete chapter 27. And I look forward to being back with you next week again.
That sounds wonderful. Rabbi, thank you so much for this very in-depth study for the first half, and I will look forward to it as well. And so to all of you who are tuning in, thanks for being patient with us. And we finally managed to push through all these little technical issues and having fun with it along the way, might I add. So we'll see you guys next week. Follow Rabbi Michael SKOBAC, JewsForJudaism.ca. You can subscribe to the website. You can donate there to support his ministry. And until next time, shalom, shalom, everyone. Love you guys.
חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה והכמיהה.